And why are you interested in running for board?
So this is going to be a bit of a monologue. I apologize.
Don't
Um,
worry.
so the way I kind of perceive um, the role in like being a board director is it deals with student experience. So that's something that I've heard from a lot of people involved in the USU. That's something I've heard Connor Werrett say. I've heard board directors and past candidates say that like the student experience is mainly what the USU concerns itself with. And I think that's true, but I also think that a student experience has two dimensions to it. And the first is around student culture. So like clubs, societies, reviews, festivals, and the other side is student support. So like, for example, making sure that we have good sexual assault and harassment training, how to deal with that at camps, having something like a disability space and ethnocultural spaces and, women's spaces. Also having, affordable food, making sure that people who aren't able to financially get into like balls or really expensive USU events have, you have equity in a lot of those, ways of getting around issues and making sure that we're reaffirming our values against racism, queerphobia, sexism, classism, ableism. All of that, I think, is really part of what the USU and what it should be doing. Last year, when I got asked this question, I think I said I concentrated a lot on student support, and I still really care about making sure that we're really building a progressive union. But I think after that point, I really kind of got thrown into like this existential crisis of like, why am I trying to do this? Like, what am I trying to achieve? Why the USU? All these different questions that I had. And I think something that board directors often do when they try and go in these elections is they don't have as much background information in what the USU is. And so they do a lot of stuff that, I could be doing this in the SRC. Why am I doing the USU? So in response to that, over the last year, I've been spending a lot of time researching the USU, and I got a USU job as a student activities officer, and I've been involved in reviews and like assistant directing reviews, and I got like elected as the environment officer, which was distinct from the USU. But from that, I learned a lot more about the USU. For example, I've worked with Ben, who's a facilities manager, I think, and we talked about something like Sustainability Week, and then you learn about how to actually integrate really progressive and activist policies into the USU system. And all that sort of has informed my policy and my passion and my drive and my direction for what I'm trying to achieve when I say that I want to be a board director. And a lot of my policy has been informed by conversations and interviews I've had with directors of reviews and presidents of clubs and societies and USU staff and counselors and just surveying people who were not members just around the university, because that's what I had to do when I was working for the USU. And so I think that those are kind of the two priorities that I'm really trying to concentrate on. And I know that a lot of candidates are going to be trying to hit those two policies, but I think what makes me unique, besides the experience and the passion and the research, is the fact that you can't just come up with ideas and ambitions. You kind of have to have a plan. And a lot of people, when they get into this role, they spend a lot of time figuring out who the personality is, what is this like institution, how do I orientate myself in a board situation. But from a lot of my experiences, I really know how to do that. And I know how to be a leader and to advocate and defend and support students. And I hate elections. I hate them with a passion. They stress me out so much. But I came back to do this election after I withdrew because of family things. I came back to do it again because I still have that vision. I still have that passion. And I really believe that I can be a positive influence in the USU, and I really believe that I have the best interest of students in my heart, and that you can trust me to be a really good advocate for you and what you kind of see as members, what you want to see in terms of change of the USU in this upcoming year, which is a crazy year.
Mm. And I guess, obviously, yeah, you did run for board director last year. So is there anything else that has sort of changed over the last year to do with your perspective on the USU or, reasons for running or those sorts of things?
I think I was a lot more cynical last year. I think I was really in an SRC mindset, which I still am. I'm very much informed by the politics of like the SRC, because that's where I kind of matured in terms of stupor. But I think now I have a greater appreciation for the mechanisms by which you can express like your politics in the USU. Like, you can be more than just a dissenting voice. I think that's kind of like a catch cry of a lot of progressive candidates, just to be like, I will, bring a board motion for this, or I'll make sure that I advocate for this in a board situation, which is part of it. But there's other ways to actually integrate progressive policies and what you want to see into the actual schema of the USU, and that's kind of what I want to do. And I think that from last year, when you start to talk to more people who really believe that the USU is something that is important and it affects their lives, you become really energized by their perspectives. And from talking to like people from performing arts societies who are incredibly affected by the decisions the USU makes, you start to realize how influential this is. And when you start to talk to people who are staff in the USU, you realize how influential the board is. And from those moments, you really understand the significance of the position. You understand the importance of its influence. You understand its connections. Like, I think Connor Word at one point was trying to advocate for the USU to have a say in who replaces Michael Spence. And that's a massive advocacy role, and you have to be well researched and you have to have all these different perspectives. And I think especially from last year, I can say that I've grown in my knowledge and my experience and my passion. And like, I was just so naive last year, but I really feel that I've come in with a lot more gravitas.
And I guess that kind of relates to our next question. So how would you describe the role of a board director?
Without repeating myself too much from last, I would say it's someone, so obviously I think this is a very special year for board directors specifically, because something that people often conflate, and what I have often done when I give presentations for the USU, is you align it with something like the clubs and societies, with the festivals, with reviews. Like, those are kind of what the imagery of the USU that people associate, and I think that's a big part of the USU as well. So when I think about the board, I really hope that the board can pick up a lot of the gaps that have been left by the staff who are no longer with us. So massive staff cuts went around when the USU was affected by COVID-19. So the Club Society office has just been emptied. Like, there's just so many people who are gone. And so I'm really hoping that the board can really step up, and it really indicates the importance of research and knowing what the USU is about and knowing how to give information in this year, because there's so many people who are struggling who need information, but there's not a lot of people who are able to give it. So I'm really hoping that the board directors specifically this year can be a greater conduit for club societies and for that sort of dimension of the USU, and being a form of communication and a big communication channel and support. That's what I really hope. But I also believe that inherent to the board director position, after what I've said about the student support dimension of it, I really believe that it is about testifying to the USU's key values of against discrimination and oppression in all its manifestations. So that means like advocating for students, who are affected by evictions on campus, things like fighting against racism or xenophobia that is a big issue on campus. Like, those things are board responsibilities, because we are a representative body of the university, of students. So you have to be able to engage with student issues. And I think that that's also a really key dimension to the USU and the board director position.
Yeah, and in terms of your policies, can you give us your 3 favorite policies and why those are your 3 favorite?
So in my 3 favorite, I'm probably not going to touch on the financial ones, only because for those who don't know, haven't been following Pulp, which they should, USU is struggling with like financial problems at the moment. So there are massive cuts, like austerity measures, I imagine, are being implemented. So when I say my favorite policies, these are the ones that aren't related to funding, which I think is something that board directors often go to, but I'm not going to do that. So that's why my first policy is setting up communication channels. So I've mentioned it before, but I think what's really important at the moment is if club societies and reviews feel like they have someone they can talk to. So what would be good, what I really hope to achieve, is to set up Facebook groups with the different categories of club societies, like performing arts or cultural. And then you can, I'll probably, if I get elected, hopefully schedule like a series of Zoom calls with each of those groups just to listen to their problems. All that sort of communication is really essential, and that also would be great if like we've updated a lot of the handbooks and the training that we have for clubs and societies. So a lot of it's outdated and a lot of it's just not adequate. So making sure that that's a big part of it. So I guess like the first point is just better relationships with clubs, societies, and reviews. That's something that I think is crucial and something that you can kind of consider me to do straight away if I were to get elected. The second is converting something like the Sustainability Week into an online festival. So that means that instead of doing a lot of the things we would have done on campus, you could do things like online panels, online discussions, online reading groups, film screenings, live streams, things like that. You can still do, you can still have festivals. And I would definitely be someone who would want to pioneer that, because obviously I'm extremely passionate about environmentalism, and that issue kind of hasn't gone away even in a COVID world. So I would really love to see the USU really getting involved in that. And the last one is like, there's so many different things. I would love to update the sexual harassment and assault training for camps. I would love to really start planning about setting up a disability space. I would really love to set up like workshops for in different languages for international students, because a lot of them have fallen behind in their subjects because of COVID-19 when they were delayed to come over. So even working with faculties to do that, faculty societies to do that. There are so many things that I really I'm excited by and I'm really passionate about. But if I had to choose one, it may be maybe I'm like maybe making a mutual aid group and working closely with the SLC, because the SLC has been doing really great work in creating a set like little packages of essential items that they're going to deliver to people who are affected by COVID-19. And I think the USU has really great sponsors and connections in that way, and so they could do really great work. And I think that's something that a lot of people really need at this time. So that's something that I would also prioritize.
Mhm. And what is your perspective on how the USU has been managing sort of student relations in this COVID-19 time?
I will preface my answer by saying that I completely understand that they were in a very difficult position, that it was really unfortunate what like the situation they were put in, because obviously their main forms of revenue are things like the facilities and the outlets, and now that they're closed, they're in a really dire situation. So I imagine that a lot of them were really busy trying to figure all that stuff out, as well as like a lot of the staff were cut. But I think the lack of communication was something that a lot of club societies were really disheartened by, especially reviews. They just found out that all the reviews were cancelled without very little consultation. And that's the sad thing, because the more you have those relationships and those consultation streams with reviews, the better chance that you could actually transition to online or digital reviews. And I know there's conversations happening in the review sphere of maybe setting up digital reviews, but that's with very little support from the USU. And at that point, you're like, why can't reviews just be independent then? So I would have preferred if clubs and societies had been consulted even before they found out that everything was going to be shut down. If someone, before hearing from the university, had just said, I don't think this is going to be safe, we should just start to organize transition all the clubs online, maybe set up a handbook which addresses a lot of concerns that clubs and societies are going to have with being online, like how to chair a Zoom meeting, or what is good Zoom etiquette, or how to prevent Zoom bombing, like those sort of things, or even how does an AGM look like if it's online? Like those are really big concerns of clubs and societies that I wish the USU would address and had addressed. But with that being said, I'm forgiving in some sense, because I know it was a busy time, but I just wish that people had maybe taken that initiative, or there had been someone who had thought this is a priority, because those people are gonna be really confused and they're gonna suffer for it.
Mm. And as you sort of previously touched upon, the USU is obviously facing unprecedented financial stress due
Mm-hmm.
to COVID-19. So if you had to, what would you cut from the USU's current operations? And then how do you think the USU should economize its operations?
Yeah. So I firstly think that one of the ways that can improve the USU in terms of culture and improve in terms of bottom line is to sub out a lot of the staff-led initiatives with student-led initiatives. So what this kind of means is that something like festivals. I worked at Pulp Fest, International Student Fest, Welcome Fest, like so many festivals, and I think that one of the ones that I'm most, I don't know, I can't say proud because I'm not involved in it, but like impressed by is something like the International Student Festival. And that's run by Kelly, who runs the International Student Lounge. And what she does, which I think is fantastic, is that she includes clubs and societies more so in the festivals. So they have all the different clubs, Italian Society, all the different cultural clubs, giving out food, and that gets massive numbers. So what I think would be really cool if some of the festivals that they were going to be running next year could actually be more inclusive of clubs and societies and better in consultation. So they do actually contact clubs and societies for festivals, but they don't give them enough time to actually prepare to be involved. or involved in any meaningful way. So I would love to have greater consultation and involvement of club societies in place of outsourcing different groups to come in. So that means you could cut money in terms of like the visitors that you have, like having to pay for like speech like panelists, or having to pay for all these different groups and the creative people that come in. Like, you know, in Pulp Fest they get like cosplay actors and all these sorts of things. And I think that during this time that's just something that you can cut. I think that Incubate obviously is also something that favors, I think, just a small group of people. I would not I think that it does like do work that is really significant to students, but during a time when we really have to make cuts, I think that you have to be, I guess, like tough with yourself and say that Incubate is probably going to only help like a small number of students, whereas like prioritizing things like clubs and studies and reviews where a large amount of students are going to be affected, those sort of things have to be prioritized. And I also same with food outlets, where we don't want to see the prices of foods increasing, so you don't really want to cut from there either. Other things that could be taken out, maybe ideas or startup creative grants. Again, this is not something that I would ever want to take away permanently, but if you were in a severe situation, something like that could be a way of cutting down as well. Those are just some ideas, but of course you have to kind of look at the budget to see really where the money is funded. Like maybe Incubate gets very little money, or maybe you know, some programs get a crazy amount. So a lot of that is like affected by what you actually see when you're in a board.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what is sort of one thing that you think that the USU has done well during your time at uni?
I think that they have. So what, from the beginning of when I started at when I started at the university in 2017, I didn't feel like I saw the USU as much. And as I've kind of grown up, as I've kind of increased in my degree, I've seen the USU really expand and really tried to put more on, have something constantly going. And I really think that's a really positive change. But I think that my favorite thing that the USU has done is convert to free membership. That is something that I think was a really positive step, one of the most positive steps since the change to voluntary student unionism. And that has also affected smaller clubs. Like I was talking to the president of CrossSoc, and he said that free membership really changed their membership, because then people who had really niche interests were able to express their niche interests without paying $75 or $90 in some cases. So that was a really positive change. And it also meant that people who wanted to get involved in clubs and societies but financially couldn't, were able to, and that just is important in terms of the class barriers that exist within the USU. I think so. I honestly think that's one of the greatest things that changed. The one thing that wasn't good in collaboration was the funding cuts to all the clubs and societies as a result.
Yeah, that's kind of my next question. So what's one thing that you think the USU has done poorly during your time at uni?
I mean, I think obviously the funding cuts are something that I think a lot of people will probably say, but I think honestly, to keep a cohesive like argument going, I think that communication is something free, something easy. I think something the board director should take up more. I think that having sort of relationships with club societies is really important. I think the willingness of the USU specifically to engage in politics is also something I really wish people improve on. Like in one of the board meetings, Connor, where it was asked about you know, whether they would talk about things like pass, fail, all those sort of issues in relation to students during COVID-19, and he kind of said it's under the purview of the SLC, but I just don't see that as being mutually exclusive. I don't think you can't comment on something simply because another student organization is expected to. And this, at the end of the day, is a union that represents students, and that means you support stuff like staff strikes. And the USU is having a really good transition. Like they condemned the Ramsey Center after many years not willing to, and they did support the climate strikes, but you can expand the way that you're willing to engage with these issues by taking further stances on things like a building which comes under the USU, which is Wentworth, is named after a colonizer, or the fact that you know, May 1st is happening and that's a worker strike. Will the USU support that? Things like these are conversations that I really hope that will come up in the USU and that need to be discussed, at the very least debated. And that's what I kind of wish the USU would have more confidence in doing.
Yeah, and you've sort of led right into my next question, which is just all about how political you think that the USU should be. Do you think that it should provide a platform for students' political beliefs? What's your position on that?
I think that denying that the board is political is either ignorant or just fake. I think that you can't pretend like the board doesn't make political decisions. It has a Pride Week, it has a Sustainability Week. These things are political. The way it orientates itself in a political manner is what I'm concerned with. Because either way, you have to make a political decision, but it's the type of politics that you choose to imbue yourself with that is important. So I believe in a left-wing political USU, and to deny that, to say that I don't think politics would be here or would be relevant, would just be complicit in the power structures or complicit in the way the USU currently functions, whether that is not left-wing or not. So the way I would want to change it is to make sure it is more explicitly left-wing, and that means like converting a lot of the ways we deal with issues into more meaningful actions. Like, for example, something the USU does is they have smoking ceremonies before festivals, which I think is a really important, if not symbolic event. What would be great or more, I think, meaningful would be to include First Nation groups more closely into the USU. So, for example, I work closely with the Indigenous Social Justice Association or Grandmothers Against Removals. I would love to see some integration of some of those groups into the USU culture, or for example, Sustainability Week, which in many ways, again, no shade to the USU last year, it was a more kind of like a greenwashing vibe. A lot of sponsors were platformed, not a lot of inclusion of students. I would love to see a Sustainability Week that is more educational about environmental issues, that includes different environmental groups. And I really do think that Ben was going to try and do that this year in consultation with different environmental groups. But also your hands are tied by the degree of change that the board is willing to let you have. And so you have to be willing to allow people to have those platforms and allow people to communicate and discuss. And something like the climate is just a very mainstream issue, and just having something like a film screening about the water crisis, and then having some form of like a great Indigenous activist like Ruth Shillingsworth to speak there would be really positive. And so I can't say that I believe that the USU is or should be apolitical, but I can tell you that I believe that it should be left-wing.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the USU should make political statements on issues that are currently impacting students' lives?
Almost certainly. I think your members look to you as representation, and you have such strong connections to things like the Senate in many ways that other student organizations don't. One person in the SLC has connection to Kip Patterson and Michael Spence, and that's the president. But in the board, you have 10 students who can band together, like we're like a weird group, that you can unite and you can have a real statement, you can have an influence on people's lives. Like, there are real issues that people are being affected by. One of them is obviously the student evictions that were happening on campus accommodation. And a lot of organizations through the SLC, even through the Environment Collective, helped change that, helped change the conditions. And still there's issues that they're having with rent suspension and that stuff that affects your members. Like, all student accommodations have special registration, which means they're automatically rewards members. So that sort of stuff should be significant to us. As well as like obviously the climate movement and making statements about that. When you have thousands, literally thousands and thousands of students walk off from your campus, that's an issue that influences your members, that they care about. There's, when you have you know, like I said, not to repeat myself, when you have issues of xenophobia, or you have a colonial name under your building, you have to engage with those issues. And not doing that is, I guess, inadvertently saying that you're okay with those things. And if you don't take a stance, it's unfortunate that people can read it in that way. So that's why I would definitely encourage people to engage in those ways. And I don't think it's isolating to any student who if you do engage with those things. It's not isolating to say that we're in a climate emergency. It's not isolating to say people shouldn't be evicted during COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. And we've seen quite a low turnout at political events like Radical Sex and Consent Week.
Yeah.
So how would you ensure more of those sort of political events are a success?
So I was at Radical Sex and Consent Week last year, and I have to say a lot of it isn't to do with the content. So there's a lot of low turnout at different events, but the USU treats festivals in different ways. So for example, Pulp Fest has coordinators, student coordinators, the campus activities campus activity coordinators who all really build up PopFest. So PopFest is set up to be successful. Something like Rad Sex and Consent Week, I don't believe was set up in the same way. And I think it was a really fruitful and positive experience. And there are different ways that we can circumvent that. So when I was at Rad Sex and Consent Week, there was a really cool panel with a sex worker and a sex positive speaker. And I went to the bar to get a drink. And the bartender was like, "What's going on here? I didn't even know about this." And I told her. And she said, "I wish you were live streaming that because I would have watched it or I would have been a part of it." So I really don't think the issue is the content of what we're trying to do. I think a lot of it is about the promotion, and that it is something above the board that I've heard from a lot of students in relation to USU events. So when I was surveying students for the USU, something that I asked was, why don't you engage with certain things in the USU student experience? And a lot of students said, "I don't have time, I live far from uni, or I have class." But something that was really common was, "I just didn't know about it." And that's something I even found when I got a job in the USU and I found out about all these clubs. Like, I didn't even know the Speleological Society was a thing, but they have such cool events. You just don't hear about that. So on something like political festivals, I think the issue is not necessarily in the content. And I think rejecting it or removing it based on that factor is wrong. I think you have to improve the way you actually engage students to go to those events. And that means things like live streaming. That means things like physical promotion. That means things like further and earlier promotion on USU social media. That means engaging more clubs and societies. That means engaging students in how things are run. That means board directors all advertise from their respective accounts. That means like all sorts of things. It means working with Pulp. It means that's kind of how you revive and resuscitate these festivals. And it has very little to do with the actual content.
Mm-hmm. And sort of switching over to something about more clubs and societies related,
Mm-hmm.
a controversial decision that the USU made was to allow the registration of Life Choice, an anti-abortion group, as you probably know, as a club.
Yeah.
So many people obviously oppose this decision because of
Mm-hmm.
its potential impacts on students who have had abortions. But what's your position on how the USU should approach these types of controversial clubs?
So the policy in clubs is they have a bunch of criteria for rejection. So firstly, they made it a rule that you can't reject a club based on your own ethical, political, religious beliefs. And the criteria for rejecting a club is stuff like it's not in line with the principles of the program. It's already being done by a different society, so the society's already been represented in other places. It has control by an exterior group. It's not on campus. Like things like that are kind of like the main criteria. With something like Life Choices, I'm extremely disappointed that it ever got made into a club, because it can be differentiated from other sort of clubs that orientate themselves around religion or politics who have similar beliefs. Like, for example, the Conservative Society or maybe CATSOC probably holds similar beliefs to Life Choices. But Life Choices is something that I don't believe is in line with the principles of the USU or all the programs, because it advocates around one specific issue that inherently alienates and isolates members of your community and your members. In the same way, I wouldn't say I wanted a group that inherently targeted one specific demographic. I think that's something that actively goes against the community that you're trying to create in the USU, and that should be a term for it not having been made a club in the first place. So it comes under the already established guidelines. In terms of removing it, I think that's a bigger deal than actually not letting it come in the first place. I wouldn't say that I like going to waste my time on Life Choices. I prefer just to like, if it came down to it, I would get into a protest against them, like with WOCO or anything like that. But there are so many things that I'm trying to do on the board that I don't think it's a priority for me to just shut them down. But with that being said, if they did anything, if there were any complaints, I would put a motion forward to have them removed finally. And I would be voting in that way to have them removed. Specifically for the criteria that I have pointed out, which I think is in line with the USU's current standards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess the next question we've got is in terms of board directors obviously have a fiduciary duty to the USU. So, have to put the board's interests above your own,
Mm-hmm.
and you can be sued you're acting against its interests.
Mhm.
So if something egregiously bad was happening at the USU, would you consider leaking this information? If not, what would you do to remedy the problem?
The classic Tom Rowie situation. For anyone who doesn't know, Tom Rowie was a board director who leaked to student publications that the USU had called police during what I think became like some form of riot between activists and police on campus. And he got in so much trouble. He got expelled and taken to court and all sorts of stuff. Firstly, I would point out that accountability is extremely important. So accountability has to begin first and foremost in the board meetings, and making sure that board directors are coming in researched, coming in well thought out, are switched on, are willing to like argue in these points of order, so that bad things aren't led to happen. So you kind of navigate the situation so those things never kind of become so extreme that you're starting to think, I should break my fiduciary duty and throw it all away just to like save the USU. Like, I hope that it would never come to that situation. Part of that is stuff like fighting, going in camera, making sure that we only go in camera for things like legal or commercial sensitive issues, and everything else is put on the public section of the board, and that Pulp and Oni are able to report on a lot of the issues and decisions that we make in the USU. But with that being said, I would never be complicit in bad, corrupt behavior. And I think that evil prospers when good people do nothing. And so if it came down to it, I would try and use my influence, and I would willingly kind of sacrifice myself if it came down to it. I don't think it's going to come down to it. I think that is the worst case scenario. But I do think that I'm principled in that way. With that being said, I would try and be very, very aware of the degree of the influence of my fiduciary duties. Like, what is the very level of discussion that I can actually have, and communication with groups like student media, and make sure that's very, very clear from the point, and making sure all board directors are clear of that, and being careful with what I'm signing and stuff like that, not being complicit in just whatever contract I'm given, making sure I'm really kind of being clear with that. So what I would say is, if it were an extreme situation, I would do as much research as I can to make sure that taking the action that I do take, which is talking to student media in the worst case scenario, is the right decision. So I would never make that lightly, because I wouldn't want to compromise the USU if I was put in that position. But with that being said, I would use firstly my experience in an executive position. I would try and talk to people personally to figure out what's going on, what's the best solution, hopefully resolve it internally, where I can talk to student media, and try and solve the situation that way.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the USU's support of the international community,
Mm-hmm.
do you think that the international student community, sorry, do you think that the USU is providing enough support, and what programs do you think have been particularly successful, or if not, how could the USU support the international student community more?
That's a really great question. So I worked for most weeks at International Student Lounge, which is, like I said, overhead by some really, really great people who work in international student programs. So I really firstly would like to state that there is never enough that you can kind of do to make sure we're being inclusive for international students, especially because they make up such a massive dimension of our USU membership. Not only international students, but Centre of English Teaching students. So they're also part of our membership. Some really positive things that I know they do is English teaching workshops. So that's a thing they do, I think it was on Wednesdays, where they would come into International Student Lounge, and you'd have a volunteer who would teach and go through and teach international students English, and you'd make a little yearbook and you could take that away as a souvenir at the end of the year. Other things that they do is they also had, what's it called? They had a mentor program with like a language exchange. So international students could meet other international students through language exchange. They had a Welcome to Sydney party. They had campus tours. I led campus tours. I led campus races. I led like off campus like tours. So I do think they have a really vibrant international student program. But of course, there is like massive changes that you can make. One example would be, I don't know if I mentioned this, probably did, but having workshops, I said in consultation with faculties to actually make students, to catch up students in COVID-19 who are really falling behind. So on WeChat, I've spoken to a lot of Juris Doctorate students and law students who are really struggling to catch up, because if they came from China, they came delayed. And then after that, when they got here, they maybe had a week to go to a tutorial. And then after that, they were put into quarantine and online learning. And they are like, just so many people are confused. And I think that, again, communication is a really big part of that. So when I was working in International Student Lounge, so many students would come in and ask me questions about, should I go home? What's going on? And I didn't know. And I just kind of directed them to the student center. So even just having more of a USU communication with the university on those issues would have been fruitful. Obviously, I think that something that Pulp does that is really good is that Bina, I think, like you translate into Mandarin, or like that's like something that's really important. But also we remembering that there are other international students, so like it'd be great to see translations into things like Arabic, and not really isolating or limiting who we kind of perceive as being international students, because there's a massive group of international students. And in terms of like something like International Student Week, making sure that we're really advertising that on different international student platforms like WeChat, I think is also really important, so that we're making sure that people realize that not only are we really encouraging international students to get involved, but we really celebrate the diversity that we have on campus. And also, again, like speaking out in the USU board about xenophobia, like there was cases of xenophobia on campus, and making sure that we're standing out and condemning that openly, which I'm pretty sure that USU did. But I think like keeping that up and making sure we do all forms of racism affected, which are currently affecting international students. Another thing we could do, I'm sorry to keep going, but and one of the most common questions you get asked when you're when you're working at International Student Lounge is, where are all the parties? And so what actually ends up happening is, after the Welcome to Sydney party, which is designed for international students, a lot of them kind of lose a lot of that community, or they get kind of involved in student housing community, so they actually don't really get involved as much with student culture on campus. So what would be cool, and what would help revive Manning is like you have, I guess, a monthly, if you could, international student party or something like that at Manning, which focus on local artists and support local artists, just so that it's a very safe environment. You can have equity officers, and the USU can control that and make sure everyone is really safe, instead of going to these external parties that a lot of international students get caught up in, that I guess separates them from a lot of domestic students on campus. Sorry, I've got building renovations, if you can hear it, and also allows them to, I guess, be in a safer environment. I don't know if I repeated myself. I got thrown by the renovations.
Sounds very good. But in terms of if you are elected as a board member, how will you ensure that student feedback is taken into consideration when making decisions?
So that's a really great question. So like I said, with the clubs and societies, so I think they're one of the greatest stakeholders in the USU. So something that I wanted to do is like set up these Facebook groups with all the stakeholders, like a review Facebook group, so I could be in consultation with like Zoom meetings. I would hopefully try and get other board directors in, and I really think that there are a lot of board directors who would be passionate about this initiative, and so I wouldn't kind of be doing it all myself, and then you'd have a greater quality. And I think that's important now in the COVID-19 world. So that's something that I would want to set up to have direct consultation with. Making sure that you read the minutes and the agenda. So read the agenda before you go into meetings, so that you already know who you need to consult. So for example, if there's a motion that's going to specifically affect facilities, then you email out to like different food vendors and say, what's your opinion on this? I think that's just basic stuff that I learned from being on the executive and on council, that you can really prepare and get feedback from stakeholders going into meetings by reading the agenda and being researched in that way. Other ways to go about it is like having more board assemblies. So what I would really advocate for is having assemblies before really big events, where any students can kind of get involved, and especially students from clubs, societies, or reviews, where they come in and talk about what they want to see from the festival, what do they want to see from the event. And that's a really great way to get them more invested in what you're trying to do, and have them take ownership about what the USU is actually trying to achieve. And I think that's also a really great way to help them make decisions. And I also think that something that the USU tried to do this year was they have like a meet the board like thing, where they put up little pop-up stalls of board directors, and you can go and ask them questions. I think that could be better advertised and better run, and I think it can be more constant. So something that And you can also use student activities officers and the V team to also be those conduits of information and give constant feedback to the USU, and I think that's really positive. But I do think the board director should take more onus and more ownership and responsibility in doing that. So that could also be a good way to get a sense of what's going on with students.
Mm-hmm. And I guess this is kind of in relation to what you're saying, but how will you ensure that the USU caters to all students?
That's, I think, in some ways impossible. I just think to say that I'm going to express like every single opinion is just untrue. But that's why we have these board elections. So the people who vote for me are voting for what they believe as being their priorities, and that's obviously student culture and student support. And then I become a representative for them, and for that group of people. I can't say that I represent anyone who is racist or homophobic, because I'm not going to. I'm not going to represent someone with conservative ideology, because that's not who I am. So I won't ever represent those people, but you have candidates who almost certainly can. And I think that that's why it's telling if you have more left-wing candidates, because that means you want to have left-wing decisions being made. And that's why if you vote in someone like me, you can, sounds so like narcissistic, but if you vote in someone like me, you can really be, you would take that as a license to be left-wing, because people voted me in because they knew I was left-wing. And so when I say that the board has to be representative, it's representative of the people who democratically elected the representation for them on the board. And that's how you kind of feel that you're representing the members, because if you're there, it's because they wanted you to represent them.
Mm-hmm. And that sort of comes to the conclusion of our formal questions.
Mm-hmm.
Any of the other editors, do you have any other questions you want to ask?
I have heaps.
Oh no, Ellie!
So first, I just want to go back to a couple of the answers before. I'll start with life choice. So you said that you think that the kind of life choice is, I suppose, an exception or an exceptional case because it caters to such a specific issue. I guess, like, would you say the same thing about other societies who are like perhaps much more benign but still cater to a particular demographic? So for instance, I know that the EU, CathSoc, but even just things like, the Vietnamese Student Society, whatever, they all cater to a particular demographic. And the EU and CathSoc actually a couple of years ago faced being deregistered quite controversially because they would only want to let Christians be on their executive or whatever. So I guess I'm just wondering, like, how does that principle extend to other clubs? Where do you think the line should be drawn?
So for me, the line is, so faith-based groups actually have an exception in the regulations for programs. So if they are only accepting certain groups, like for example, they're only accepting, I'm so sorry, I can hear like typing or something.
Oh, sorry, I was opening the package.
That's so fine. I was just like, I can't think. Yeah, so I would say, to repeat myself, I would say that so faith-based groups actually have an exception written into regulations for programs, which is same with autonomous groups. So like if you only elect a certain individual or type of individual into an autonomous position, it has to be declared, and same with faith-based groups. So if you only accept people on a certain faith, then you have to have that in a declaration. And the declaration has has all these rigorous things that you have to do. It has to be in line with your constitution. It has nothing to do with the personal identity. It has to do with it has to be well proven. And then even still, like, it has all these different people looking over and making sure that's okay. With something like life choices, I think my issue with it is more so that it's alienating specifically on a personal basis than actually a belief. So for example, if I had an abortion and I saw someone whose whole mission, whole club and whole constitution aim is that a life begins in the womb, and that my choices that I've made are unethical, and I've killed a child, that would be extremely traumatic. Like, that is a horrible experience that anyone should go through. Whereas, like, for example, like CathSoc, there is so much more to CathSoc than just pro-life. Like, for example, they do other various religious things. I don't know. But Catholicism and other interest-based groups come around a sort of established interest, or even the Vietnamese Society, or etc., etc. And they are in some forms exclusionary because they have a certain membership base. but it does not necessarily mean that their whole purpose is to exclude or even to condemn a certain group. I suppose like CATSOC and like EU can be accused of those things, and obviously they had controversial behavior, which is why they came up with the question of being removed. And if the life choices were as, for example, as openly, I guess, controversial as they could possibly become, I would definitely advocate for them being removed. Right now, they're quite like they do really like they do controversial stuff, but they're more, I guess, like internal. Like I don't hear about them as much. I don't hear about them in the women's collective as much. But if they were to become that, I would be like remove them.
Yeah, so I guess the distinction here is between like targeting other students versus just being exclusionary. Cool.
Yeah, sorry, I'm rambling to like try and get to the point.
Okay.
Targeting students versus like having a sort of membership base.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then on the question about representing all students, so obviously like you don't want to be representing races and stuff like that. But in your answer you said that the other board candidates can represent other demographics. How do you think then the board as a whole should kind of combine those demographics or those different interests and even different political leanings?
I think that the fundamental expectation for a democratically elected representative group is that you have debates, and that I think that the issue I have with a lot of groups, even left-wing individuals, is that they're too scared to even have those debates. Like those debates need to be had. And even if I failed in one of those motions, which I would hope that would never happen, but will inevitably happen if I were to get into board, is that I would still have had the opportunity to have that debate and represent the left-wing people who wanted me to represent them. And even if the whole board turned out to be like right-wing conservatives, which I perceive as being impossible because I don't think the candidates are like that collectively right-wing, at least I was there to advocate and to dissent and to represent. And obviously there are going to be issues where we, disagree. And a lot of that will come down to research and articulation and arguments. And that's the way it's significant to not only have a left-wing individual, but a left-wing individual who can articulate those arguments. But yeah, so obviously there's going to be situations of like compromise. There's going to be situations where we have to work together. But at the end of the day, there has to be those debates and there has to be those conversations. And win or lose, you kind of have to have someone who's representing those issues. The conclusion in some ways is, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but not as significant as the opportunity, in my opinion.
Cool, thanks. So another thing I want to kind of go back to or expand on is you mentioned at the start of the interview, like Michael Spence leaving and finding a replacement. I just want to know, like, what what do you think the USU should look for or fight for in Michael Spence's replacement? Are there any characteristics you think they should have?
Yes, I definitely think that they should be willing to discuss with students more on what they're trying to achieve. They should have a lot more respect for student organizations like the SRC. I think that they should hold left-wing views and student-centric views. So, and be willing to change with the times and be progressive. Like, for example, under Mike Spence's administration, the university invests $22 million in the fossil fuel industry. There's massive campaigns on campus. There's so many environmental groups who are clearly advocating. There's a distinct group that its whole purpose is to get the university to divest from the fossil fuel industry. And I would love to see a chancellor or vice chancellor who is willing to be responsive to the climate on campus and change their priorities according to that. Same with the Ramsey Center. Like Michael Spence really wanted the Ramsey Center. But I like, you have to also acknowledge and be aware of like how that's going to affect students. And so I'd want a vice chancellor who really considers not only students as a whole, but I guess minorities particularly, and making sure that the campus is something that is really accepting. I think we have less than 1% Indigenous student population. And I did an article at one point which was researching about low SES retention rates, and amongst like low SES students, they're the most likely to drop out, and that's a lot to do with the culture on campus. And the vice chancellor should really be looking into trying to improve that and trying to improve outreach. So, and those are inherently progressive ideology or ideals. So those are the sort of things I would hope that the vice chancellor would really prioritize, as well as student experience. Student experience at USU is like very bad in comparison to, well, not very bad, but like not as high as they really wanted to be, or how high in comparison to other like grade 8 universities. And that's why they really wanted to improve on reviews. And like Pip Patterson would come into these big student culture meetings and try and have these conversations about how to improve the culture on campus. And so I'd want a vice chancellor who came in with those ideas and willingness to support the arts, support, like, for example, student theatre, and someone who wouldn't convert like the footbridge theatre into a lecture theatre over an actual, what it originally was, which was a student theatre. So things like that, I think those are the two dimensions that are, again, really like bled into my policy and my USU platform that I really want to see from a vice chancellor. But of course, it would also take a lot more research in me answering that question, and it would also take a lot more consultation with different individuals about what they wanted to see.
Cool. And then finally, just a couple of, I guess, kind of administrative questions. First off, are there any candidates that you particularly like or think you could work with? And are there any candidates you maybe don't like or don't think you could work with or support as easily?
My God, so scandalous. I think what's important this year specifically is international student representatives, specifically because a lot of international students are being affected by COVID-19, and I think those perspectives are super important. And I know Vicky besides me, has been the only one who's worked within the USU, so she was a campus activities coordinator, so I definitely think Vicky is really great. I think like the Labour candidates, I think they have very similar like broadly left-wing policies, so definitely think that they're really like great and cool. I think in terms of probably not going to work with very well is probably obviously the Liberal candidates. I'm obviously not on the same wavelength as those candidates. And I think they do generally kind of run these apolitical campaigns, which I think are a little disingenuous. And I think that there was like, accusations of stacking against like one of the candidates who became president. And I think that's a little bit, I don't think that's fully in line with what the USU stands for. And I would question the honor of the student. But then again, I don't know him personally, but I can definitely say on a little party basis, I probably won't work with him very well. But I can, but I just suffer.
All good. And do you have any preference deals or something like that in the works?
God, no. I mean, like everyone's obviously talking to each other, but those things, especially now everything's online, is so confusing. So I haven't got anything like set up.
And final question is just what color will you be running under?
I'll be running on yellow, the same as my earrings, I think.
No. Cool.
Cool.
Unless anyone has any other questions, I think that's it.
Yay. Thank you for all the great questions. So well done.
Thank you.